Yep.
And onto this character now, who every childhood, grew up with. Dizzy. Your next release was a cartoon adventure. Was that the breakthrough?
That was an interesting one. So it wasn't the next game. What actually happened was we'd done Super Robin Hood, and that was starting to sell really well. So we thought we'll follow that one up with something, and we thought let's do another side-on platform game using pretty much the same code base. We'll just change all the graphics, change all the theme, and we obviously. Standing in WH Smith's, we're looking at Ghostbusters going, that game sells because people know what it is and it's a brilliant movie. So we did Ghost Hunters. Um, and that was our actual follow-up to Super Robin Hood. And whilst doing that, we observed that Richard and David Darling, the owners of Codemasters, were making a lot of money off Super Robin Hood and several other games, and they wrote a couple of games as well. And they both bought sports cars. And when we turned up at Codemasters one time, we saw that they'd both bought brand new sports cars. And we said, we'd like to own sports cars. We need to have a game that's more successful. And we just made a passing joke. Hey, if we made a game about racing cars, we could probably buy a racing car.
You have gone up with money. The question was about Dizzy.
It was. So anyway, we actually did Grand Prix Simulator next, and whilst writing, stepping back, whilst writing Ghost Hunters, we just said, this is really good idea using the same code base and writing another game that's completely different. We should do this again after Grand Prix Simulator. We should do this again, but come up with a completely different theme again. So we've just done castles and medieval. We've done a ghost themed game, sort of haunted house. So now let's try and come up with another theme. And the theme was, well, let's do something kind of fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, that sort of thing, Dungeons and Dragons. Let's do something like that. And whilst we were discussing
having said that, you've only got 8 colours. And I remember when we were doing the Ghost Hunters, you're trying to make something atmospheric and scary. And all you've got is like 8 prime colours. It's bloody hard to give it.
And small sprites.
And then small sprites. So we were like, well, if this was a cartoon game, like a Disney thing, it would be bright and colourful. And actually, we were pushed towards bright and colourful graphics. And we were like, okay, we'll kind of go with it next time.
Yeah. And also, one of the things that we'd seen a year or so before, at the Ideal Home exhibition of all places, I seem to remember, was a console running a game called Smurfs, which you probably know, the licensed Smurfs and the cartoon series. And there was a Smurfs game running that we saw on a console just as our parents were walking around looking at food mixers and whatever you do at Ideal Home exhibitions. And me and Andrew spotted this game and started playing this game. And again, that was another point where it's like, hey, look at this game. It's like you control the main little cartoon character and it's a side on and you run around and you have to sort of not solve puzzles in that game. You just have to get from left to right. And that was another bit of inspiration for us. So Dizzy was all about sort of the third game in the series of side on adventures with us trying to make a cartoon character.
It's a very original game. Around 1987 circa, was it?
So 86, I think it was written in March and came out in May of 86.
Very ahead of its time as well.
Thank you.
On to the second.
Not bad for about 38k memory.
Yes.
I think it had something like 70, 80 screens, characters and puzzles. And in that amount of memory, it amazes even us. I mean, you couldn't have an icon on a phone or something with that sort of memory. I mean, I think it was about 38k. It was
not even that. I think it's 32k because after you take screen RAM away, Andrew.
Yeah. So, but it's it's quite amazing what could be done. But I have to say, we spent all of our time literally counting the bytes of, like, when you write pieces of code, it's like, well, can I write it with a couple of less instructions to be more efficient and faster? We did a lot of
that. Onto your second adventure, Treasure Island. It just featured the one life. It didn't feature the main protagonist, Wizard Zax, as well.
So, well, the idea was to have a different story. So,
Mhm.
who needs Zax if you're doing a completely different story? We later discovered that actually people do like the main protagonist, so we actually reintroduced him. But the reason for introducing Treasure Island Dizzy was that you said our next big hit was Dizzy. Actually, the funny thing was that when we released Dizzy, nobody really understood what it was, knew what it was. Reviews did quite well, but the sales were actually quite slow. When people saw Robin Hood on the shelf, they saw Grand Prix Simulator, they saw Ghost Hunters, they knew what they were getting because they felt like licenses. Dizzy, people looked at it, it's like, I don't know what that is, move on to the next kind of box on the shelf. So actually, it was quite a slow seller. But over time, it got more and more of a reputation. And we realized the reason we could tell this is because Codemasters would get lots of fan mail turn up to the Oliver twins all about Dizzy. And they said they got so much fan mail about Dizzy and kind of no fan mail about anything else. And so it kind of occurred to us that we'd created something that people really, really loved and were wedded to. And we thought, well, for that audience, let's make them another game. And we made the other game sort of a year later. And we weren't exactly sure what to kind of expect. We thought it would do okay. But actually, it went ballistic day one. And we think that everybody who bought Dizzy originally went out day one and bought the Treasure Island Dizzy immediately. But of course, that sent it straight to number one in the charts, got loads and loads of publicity. So Codemasters was kind of duplicating as fast as they could just to supply the demand. So instantly, it was a massive bestseller.
You also
And that's when we realized we had a hit on our hands.
But then we also had regrets because we suddenly had this number one bestseller that was selling really well, and having some regrets about it. The One Life thing was a little bit to do with the bug. We just thought, oh God, if we knew it was going to sell so well, we could have made it so much better, which just spurred us on to make Fantasy World Dizzy, which is the one we're sort of most proud of in the fact that it was just the two of us, but we put so much effort into it, thinking, right, we're kind of pretty much sure this is going to be number one, so it better be bloody good. Whereas the Treasure Island was always, I wonder if it's going to go down well, and it is. Sometimes it is how confident you are about making stuff and how much effort and work you put into it. Because you have to believe in something to just sort of like put so much work into something without actually knowing.
It takes so much work, Andrew. It was actually only 6 weeks, but
I mean, yeah.
And there we were confident that it could be a number one bestseller. The only one that might knock it off the shelf of being a number one bestseller was the other game we were writing at the same time, which was Ghostbusters 2.
Yes, we actually were.
Which we wrote alongside it.
We wrote it at the same time, which was kind of funny. Yeah. Anyway,
You mentioned as well, like the excitement of going into like the newsagents as well. As a kid growing up, it was Virgin Megastore for me. You walk in and you see all the games on the shelves. It was an eye opener.
It was Woolworths and W.A. Smith for us.
Also, I wanted to, because the games are very affordable as well. Like, say, if you're on 50p pocket money, you could buy a game if it's $3.99 in a month or two, couldn't you?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, we actually really enjoyed making budget games. Back in those days, there were kind of two main price points. There was the budget games, which were started at $1.99, then went to $2.99, and then there was the high price games, which were either $9.99 or $12.99. And we really enjoyed making those budget games because we could be a lot more experimental with them. People were a bit more forgiving if there were bugs in them. Not that our games contain that many bugs, but all games contain some bugs. But we would much rather more people played our games than less. So you could sell a game for 5 times the amount, but then 5 times. But we'd rather sell it to 5 times more people and get the same income that way. And that's what we think we did. We were achieving. We were, because our sales were so high at those budget prices, we were receiving the same kind of royalties that somebody would receive on a high price game and just sell a lot less of them.
What are you also?
The other thing was, it was our sort of, we didn't have much for life. Our friends had gone to university and we were just heads down on our own, just work. like all hours of the day, and we could blitz it through for 6 weeks or whatever it took to write a game and get it out there and then go and do something completely different. And yes, we did come back and do some sequels of games, but we did had a break. Whereas actually something like the Ghostbusters 2 that we wrote, I think it was a 9 or 10 month contract, and we wrote games alongside it, but it did seem to just drag on and drag on. And there's one thing about it's not the technology changing, but the way in which we were coding and things were changing so fast that each game we wanted to do something a little bit different or push a little
a new area.
Yeah. Whereas when you're working on Ghostbusters, it's like, I wrote that code up 5 months ago. It's a bit old and crap, and I can't exactly remember how it works, but just leave it alone, don't break it. And
but it was also
short games.
But whenever you did high price games, you were expected to sort of do large designs, schedules, you had negotiations on the money and all this. With all those Codemasters games, Codemasters knew about what we were producing when we gave them the master and we handed it over and go, another game for you. Whereas with something like Ghostbusters, you spend a month kind of negotiating a schedule and trying to understand what it is that you're describing, that you're quoting for, and kind of how it's going to land. And you don't really know yourself because you haven't designed it yet. I mean, this is one of the things the games industry is. They always tell you, and we've done so many games, obviously, whenever you negotiate a contract, they say, how much? And you go, we don't have a design yet. No, I want to know how much it's going to cost. It's like, we haven't designed it yet. It's like, well, no, you must know how much. And it's like, I haven't fucking designed it.
Philip just got into a standard thing. Like Philip would always do the business and the contracts, but certainly with THQ, Philip just turned it on them and said, like, okay, this next SpongeBob game or whatever, it's like, and Philip would just, I mean, once you got a good relationship with people, and we've done several games, and he just sit down and go, well, how much money, and we'll make the best game we can with the money you give us and the time frame and the sort of, and then let's just discuss a sort of a story, a scenario, and a rough breakdown of a schedule. And it's like, but when they start saying, well, how many characters, how many levels, how realistic will they be, and all this, it's like, well, that'll take a little while to work out, but we'll be kind of, we'll do it together.
We'll do it together.
Yeah, exactly. We'll do it together as we go. And it was a really good relationship. It's a shame that THQ obviously went bankrupt, but it was a really good relationship because there was just a big trust of like, yeah, just do another game. And we did do, I don't know, a good 15, 20 games for THQ.
And one of the highlights of the Dizzy game is always being like stuck in certain scenarios. And when you open up the game cassette, you saw like a list of hotline numbers for you to ring if you got stuck. I actually listened to
the 0898.
That's
the 0898.
I actually listened to a recording on one of them. It's on some SoundCloud platform. And did you have any inputs with that at all?
So what actually happened was, the story behind the 0898, what actually happened was that people were writing in these fan letters, and I mentioned these earlier, and quite often the fan letters were, hi Oliver Twins, I've been playing your latest Dizzy game, Treasure Island Dizzy or whatever, and I think it's just brilliant, and I've been doing this, and I've been doing that, Get to down to the second paragraph, but I'm stuck. I've done this and I've done that, but I can't work out how to go, like, open that, break that, move on. Please, can you tell me? So what happened was, when we got to Fantasy Worlds Dizzy in October '89, that was released, is that we decided that because the secretaries at Codemasters would get all these kind of ton of letters turn up, that we'd do a walkthrough script, and then the reception staff could actually answer those letters rather than binning them or rather than giving them to us. So we said, look, what we'll do is we'll give you this script. You'll be able to just look through the script and say, oh, they're stuck just here. Here's the answer you need, and write them a lovely letter saying, I'm so pleased that you love Dizzy. The answer to your question is this. And we thought, yes, brilliant. So I wrote this nice little script and everything and gave it to them. And the next I knew, the following week, is what they'd done is they chucked it on the photocopier and just done a ton of photocopies, and everybody that wrote in with fan letter saying I'm stuck, they were basically folding up a copy of the photocopy, the photocopy, and sending it to them. And I was like, what are you doing? it's like you're ruining the rest of the game for them. That's not what we planned this for. The idea was you read through, you worked out the answer, when you put it in, just gave them the one bit they need. No, we're just doing it this way. We can't be bothered to do that. It's like, oh, that's a bit of a shame. And we were just discussing it, but we had this script. And then at the same time, somebody mentioned something about 0898, and I can't remember exactly how that conversation came about. And we said, oh, we could record that script and then people can listen through just to answer the question that they want and then hang up. So they haven't taken away like the fun of all the rest of it. And we're like, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Let's record that script. Let's do that. And then we gave that to Codemasters and said, you can make that in 0898. So they went off, negotiated a deal with the 0898 company, BT. And they put that out, and it was phenomenally successful. But 0898, as we didn't really think about, generates loads of cash, which actually wasn't the reason for doing it. But all of a sudden, it's like all this cash. So I quickly went into David Darling and said, now, wait a minute. We gave you this kind of finished cassette. We came up with this idea, and now you're taking all the money. That's not right. We want to share this money. So anyway, struck a deal. They gave us a big cut of that money. And then, because it was generating so much cash, we did it across other games, and they went across all their other games and all their authors and said, please give us 0898 scripts for all these games, which for Dizzy games works really well. But for things like Pinball Simulator, really, and for, I don't know, whatever other games they were doing it for, Micro Machines or whatever, it's like, yeah, it's not really suitable. But they just basically just did it across all the games.
Well, thanks for clearing that up. That's always been a curiosity of mine, the 0891 numbers. But my next question I was going to ask you, what I liked about the Dizzy games, they're very easy to play. You could use the keyboard to play it with such simple letters, like Z for left, X for right, and space in return.
Accessibility is most important, and that's something that we were really, really keen on, because we'd played so many games ourselves where it's like, what are the keys on this game? What are the keys? We can't work it out. Whereas when we were playing BBC Micro games and Acorn Soft games, they had a consistent keyboard layout for all of their games. And we really loved that. And we thought, well, this makes sense. You just load up a new game and you know what the keys are. So
yeah, but you went in the arcades and stuff, and it was typically a joystick with two buttons. It was so you had left, right, up, down, A and B. And it was like, look, if they can do any game you could think of in the arcades with those, and that's what we're doing, and we're going to stick to it or whatever. And I have to say, over the years, particularly as PC games came out, people would go, "Oh yeah, it's all those." Like they'd have about 16 odd keys across the keyboard for doing things, and you'd have almost the function keys or number keys for doing features like changing weapons and stuff. And going, "Oh my god, it's just like mental." And to be fair, it's a little bit of a criticism of PlayStation games and stuff. It did a sort of not amuse me, but it's so geekish to make a game that uses all the buttons on the controller, and in some ways you can argue that they shouldn't have quite so many buttons on controllers, because people who are really into their games, they just go, oh yeah, we know what to do. It's like, because you just get used to like not looking down and pressing X, Y, A's and B's and shoulder button, top shoulder button, bottom shoulder button, all these buttons or whatever. If you're a gamer, that's no problem at all. Now, if you're not a gamer and you're coming into that, you just go, oh, where do I even start? Which is the reason that the Wii took off, because the Wii came out with a very simple controller. You wave it around and you point a couple of buttons, and you know what? It worked. So even though everyone knew that there was such an inferior computer to the PlayStation and the Xbox, people said, oh, accessibility is so easy and it's fun. Whereas actually we were getting to a point where the Xbox and the PlayStation is, look, it's the same game as before. It looks more realistic and it's bloody complicated controls. You really have to know what you're doing, like Call of Duties or Forzas or whatever.
Also, the next question I'm going to ask for you now, going into, like, say, Virgin Megastore, John Menzies, or what have you, I always used to look on the graphics on the back of the artwork or the cassette. I noticed when I was a kid, I noticed that the Amiga had so much more kind of detailed graphics
It's a 16-bit expensive machine. That's why.
Did you have creative input with that also? That side.
So yeah, I actually had a decent graphic chip as well. Yeah, so I have to say, screenshots on the back of a box was just so important, and I have to say that one of the reasons why Codemasters was really successful is because so many games companies in the early '80s were run by businessmen duplicating cassettes, putting them out. They didn't really understand the games. They didn't really understand their customers properly, but they did know how to duplicate cassettes, do printed covers, get them into the distribution channel, do all the business side of things, cash flow, etc., etc. They knew the business side of things. Richard and David came along with they understood games, they knew how to make games, but also they knew how to sell games and package them really well. Codemasters packaging was around the best, but it was also the cheapest games on the shelves as well. And they always used clear boxes, and they always put screenshots on the back, and they always used great text. Codemasters' genius was, I mean, they had some good games, don't get me wrong, we did some of them, but their genius was their packaging. Their packaging was awesome, and they always had great graphics on the back.
The problem that I have with Amiga games, though, although obviously ST and Amiga games, they looked better because it was better graphics chips and a 16-bit computer. But what sort of annoyed us a little bit about those games was the fact that nearly all of the sort of budget was spent on art. And very often the games are pretty much identical, if not quite often inferior. There was a few sort of very big games which got a lot of publicity because they looked amazing. And you go, well,
Rise of the Machines.
Rubbish game.
Was it right? No, Rise of the Robots. Rise of the Robots. Yeah,
quite a few, and they just were rubbish games, but they kind of looked nice, but there wasn't anything in there. Whereas other games looked a bit ugly, and it had to play on the gameplay. If the gameplay and the stories and the characters or whatever didn't work, then you couldn't save it. Whereas on the Amiga, you could just save anything with good graphics. I have to say, the same could be said for Hollywood. You can dress up a really crappy movie with some good visuals and get away with it.
Not mentioning any particular studios.
No.
And also, what are your impressions of the fans' versions of the Dizzy games? They make their own kind of versions of them these days.
It's really nice, and it's really humbling that people love Dizzy that much. They're prepared to put the effort in to make their own games, and some of them are absolutely astounding. I mean, the remake of Crystal Kingdom Dizzy was absolutely staggering. I mean, it was better than the version that we created. Actually, we didn't create all of that version because it got consumed inside Codemasters with other people. But it was astounding what they pulled off with kind of modern technology. But there's
modern technology on a spectrum. So they used a proper paint Photoshop and things to create the graphics, but they were Spectrum compatible graphics.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's really nice. There are so many Dizzy fan games, so don't quiz us on them. But they range right from just kind of real amateur stuff all the way up through to games which are superior to the originals, and that's pretty amazing, quite frankly. One of the things we hadn't appreciated until we've got a book that came out in about 2016, I think it was, and we didn't appreciate this book, what is it called? The Story of the Oliver Twins, Let's Go Dizzy. It got sent around various places, and a copy found itself at a museum in Russia. And we hadn't appreciated this. In fact, it was in Mariupol. It was in Ukraine. We hadn't appreciated this. Yeah, it did. It got a direct hit and everything destroyed. Well, the whole city of Mariupol got destroyed, obviously. But we got told by the curator there that actually Dizzy was the biggest character during the 90s, like video game character during the 90s, because they weren't allowed consoles. So Sonic and Mario had never made it there. And they weren't really allowed any kind of computers from the West, but they were making these hooky Spectrums by getting making them in garages themselves and kind of hand building Spectrums, but then they needed games for them. And by the early 90s, Dizzy was such a popular game that was the one that was getting mass pirated by everybody. And so a lot of the fans of Dizzy, there were a lot of Russians who that was their main character, but also they were playing on a computer which they could program, and so a lot of their fan games are actually Russian made, which we hadn't appreciated.